Hello my dear YouTuber friends, and I do hope you're all keeping well. Welcome to this new video, and this is Back to Basics Part 9. VOR Navigation in Glass Cockpit Displayed Aircraft like the Cessna 172, the Grand Caravan, using the G1000 NXI in this case, how to do VOR to VOR navigation in Glass Cockpit Displayed Aircraft. There's a couple of differences between how you do VOR flying in these type of aircraft to something like the Cessna 152, but once you get used to it, it's actually quite easy. So let's not dilly-dally, let's get into the video. Okay, so I'm set up at Coventry Airport in the UK, Coventry, at runway 5, as you can see there, in the Cessna 172 with the Hodgson livery. By the way, if you go to my Discord, you can download this Hodgson livery if you want to join Discord and download that. You'll be able to there. What I'm going to do, I'm going to switch you to the map view. Now, I covered this in the last Back to Basics video in the Cessna 152, and I went through it quite thoroughly. I'm going to go through it again quickly to give you a quick catch-up. VORs on an aviation map. I've just gone to skyvector.com as an example. Any aviation website or map will do. If you look on the map, we're over England, obviously, in this case, you'll find these circles with sort of little notches. It's 36 of them. For every 10 degrees of the compass, essentially. And you'll have a center box or something similar like this. And you'll have a frequency next to it. In this case, this is the Daventry VOR. And that's the frequency we need to tune into, which we will do later with this one. But they're all over the world. This is England, like I've said. But there's one there. There's all in different places. You can see one here where my mouse is, one here. Right over Land's End, there's one there. All different parts of the world at various different locations. And essentially, instead of using autopilot, you can use these VOR to manually fly towards your chosen location. I'm going to show you this again in the Cessna 172 in a moment. Let's just switch the web page. And I've showed this before in the last video. Go and watch that for a more thorough explanation. But VORs, if you think of them like a bicycle wheel, you have the center and you have the spokes of the wheel all leading out or in. In this case with the VOR, these are called radials, and for every 10 degrees of the compass, you've got a radial. And if you're flying towards a VOR, you can lock on essentially to one of these radials and fly towards the center. Or if you're at the center of the VOR, you can fly away from it, again by locking onto one of the radials. I'll show you this in more detail later. That's a brief explanation of what a VOR is. You can lock onto it by dialing in one of the, or by putting in one of the frequencies of the VOR in your aircraft, fly towards it using one of the radials, and you can fly away from it, and then you can follow a map VOR to VOR, so fly from VOR to VOR to VOR, etc, etc. That's a brief explanation. Okay, let's get back into the aircraft. Go and watch my previous Back to Basics video for a deeper explanation of that if need be. Back in the aircraft, let's just go back in the cockpit. Oh, before I do that, let's go back to Daventry VOR. Make a note of that frequency, 116.4. We're here at Coventry, runway 5, which is here where my mouse is, heading in this direction. So that VOR, just as a reference, if I'm looking on a map, I can tell that's about maybe about 110, 120 degrees from my direction I'm facing at the moment. Just keep that in mind, and keep in mind the 116.4. Back to the sim. Into the aircraft we go. Now, let's just give you a quick overview of the G1000 or the Cessna 172 nav controls and setup. So your nav knobs are here. You can change this frequency. This is your nav. You see there, nav written down. That's nav 1. These two numbers here, or frequencies, are nav 1. This is nav 2. We're not going to be using nav 2, but we are going to be using nav 1, which is this top one. That's the standby nav, so you can alter the numbers using these knobs. Inner knob to alter the number before the decimal, and outer knob to alter the number after the decimal. Once I've got my frequency dialed in 116.4, so let's do that. 116, inner knob to put that to 116, outer knob to 0.4 or 40. Once I've got that, I can hit this swap nav button to make that now my active nav. So I can't alter that number anymore, this one here, but that's now my active nav frequency. Handy thing about the Cessna 172 Grand Caravan G1000 in general, it gives you the code for the VOR after. Once you've got it as your active, it will give you the code for the VOR. In this case, DTY for Daventry, so we know we're tuned in to the correct VOR. Very handy. So now what do? We got GPS. We can't use GPS if we're using VOR navigation. So we're going to have to press the CDI button to change this display to VOR 1, or effectively nav 1. Now, there's some symbology on here, and it took me a while to figure this out. How can you tell whether you're flying away from or to a VOR? Actually, VOR is great because we are flying towards VOR, so that's what this stands for. We're flying towards the VOR. Well, flying away from it, in fact, at the moment. How you can tell, this is your main arrow. If I alter, I'm going to go into this in more detail in a moment, but if I alter this CDI, which is effectively our OBS knob from the Cessna 152, it effectively does the same thing. I'm altering that to get that line to join these other lines, as you can see there. Now, if I took off and flew towards this direction, which is about 310 degrees, I'm actually going to be flying away from that VOR. And how I can tell this is this arrow here. If it's pointing in this direction away from the main arrow, so in the opposite direction, that's telling you you're flying away from the VOR. To fly to the VOR, we would have to alter this knob again, mouse up on it. And remember I told you before, from our current location, the Daventry VOR visually on the map is about 120 degrees, maybe 110. I'm going to keep altering this, moving this knob up, mousing up on it. Watch this arrow, it will change in a moment. And CRS stands for course, by the way, so that's the course we're altering there. It's not altering anything in the aircraft apart from the reference course that it's telling us we need to fly towards. It's not altering anything else in the aircraft. Now you can see this arrow is now pointing up, which means we're flying, if we flew in this direction now where we are, which is roughly our direction we're heading, we'll be flying somewhat towards that VOR, and we can tell that because that arrow is now pointing up towards the main arrow. Let's keep altering this CDI knob to get this line to the center. And what this will do is give us a reference heading, so it should start to come to center any moment now. So it's a bit further than 120, maybe 130. Yep, 130. So what this is telling us now is lock on to 130 degrees, take off, fly towards 130 degrees to lock on to that 130 degree radial. Remember the radials I showed you before? Let me just quickly refresh your memory, this will help. So the radials I showed you before, to lock onto that 130 degree radial, to fly towards well, we'll actually be flying towards this way. To fly towards that Daventry VOR. I do hope this is making sense. Go and watch the previous Back to Basics video if this is not. That's a more simplified VOR nav system. That's the kind of old style system in the Cessna 152. This is more digital, but it's effectively telling us the same thing. Takeoff, head to. This is giving us a reference bearing to head towards 130 degrees. To lock on to that radial to fly us towards the centre of the Daventry VOR, which is what we've got dialed in. I do hope that's made sense, but it might make sense as we go along. So I'm going to throttle up, release the parking brake, all the good stuff. So we'll just get up to speed here. Oh, I'm going to press my B button because I knew my altitude wasn't set correct there. Now it is. Should have done that before, but never mind. Typically press your B button on your keyboard just to make sure your altitude at your chosen runway is correct. It was about 300 feet above sea level, so I'm going to climb to about 1600 feet. Oh, and also, I'm going to turn left. You can see that course has now changed. That line has gone down. Because the relative... Our aircraft has changed. Our relative position of the aircraft has changed since I altered that course. It's another difficult one to get your head around. But basically, this line will constantly move the closer we get towards the VOR. Just to keep us locked onto the radial. And because our aircraft position has changed, that line has changed as well. So I'm going to fly past that heading, it's telling us there, to bring this line, or to coax it back into the centre. And also keep an eye on my altitude. Live weather, live multiplier, lovely sunny day over most of England it seems at the moment. Seems like summer is on its way, which is nice. I believe next week we're going to get another cold snap, or something's going to happen with the weather, which is pretty typical for the English weather. Never stays fine for too long. So I'm just flying past that heading, slightly sort of east or right of it, to coax that line back towards the centre, like we did with the Cessna 152. And once it's centred, I'll try and match my heading to that line, that arrow pointing upwards, which is about 130 degrees, to fly us towards the centre of the VOR. I'm not keeping an eye on my altitude, am I? That will do. That will do. It doesn't need to be perfect. So I'm just going to trim, just to maintain level flight. There we go, line's somewhat moving back towards the centre now. It's like someone's flying an F-16 or F-18 next to me, that's fine. Why not? How's that altitude? Altitude's fine, that line should start to move back towards the centre. I'm just going to come to the right a little bit more, but it's not moving much. Come to wherever that line is, if it's left or right, it's right in this case. Fly past that heading, that arrow, to move that line back in the centre, and that will put us on a perfect approach effectively for that VOR. Now it's moving back to the centre, so I'm just going to swing to the left, bank to the left, swing, bank to the left. Yeah, that Jets is either one of my viewers or he's just come to disrupt the stream, but we shan't let him. We shan't let him. There we go. So I'm heading towards that VOR pretty much fairly perfectly now. The lines are pretty much joined up. I can come to the right a little bit more there. Hissing tie. Just flying above me there. That's great. There we go. That will do. So if I just keep it there now, we'll be flying towards the centre of that Daventry VOR. I'm about 136, 135, so I can bring that round back to about 130, which it should be. See, this is at my actual bearing. That's my reference bearing to fly towards that VOR. Again, you're best watching the previous video because I did a very thorough overview of the VOR. This is just a carry-on video of how to do it in the Cessna 172. As we get towards, actually, with the G1000, it's handy because we can see on this map where Daventry is. If I range out a little bit, there's the Daventry DTY VOR. It shows them on this map if you have the settings all set in. So I can see how visually how far I am away from that, which is quite useful. Let me just keep an eye on my heading there. I've come to the left a little bit too much. Got acrobatics happening in front of us. If you are one of my viewers, well done. Very nice. Very nice to see. Oh, my alt's climbing a little bit more than I wanted to, so I'm just going to trim a little bit there. What's my speed? Yeah, I can pull back my throttle slightly as well. So there we go, we'll just keep flying towards it. I'll keep an eye, keeping this screen, why not? There's the Daventry VOR just here. As we get towards that, and I want to get towards this one, actually fly through the VOR, through the center, to show you how we can fly away from a VOR as well. Just banking to the left to get that line back into the center. And after we flew through it, or through the center of the VOR and flying from it, I'm going to show you that you can actually use a bit of autopilot with VOR flying as well to make your life a little bit easier. As long as you've got the controls set up, or you can use the knobs in the actual on the G1000. And you can make life a little bit easier for yourself doing it that way too. I'll show you that in a moment. There we go, let's just come back to this view to see what's happening in the outside world there. So I hope that makes sense. It's a little bit different. With the Cessna 152, you have a to and from tab, so it's easy to tell whether you're flying away from or towards a VOR. In this case, just keep an eye on this arrow here, this triangle, effectively. If it's there pointing towards your big arrow, you're flying towards it. If it's here pointing away from it, which it will be later, I'll show you that, you're flying away from it. Just keep an eye on that. Oh, there we go. It's flying very close to me now. Oh, well, a bit of company. We've got an armed escort flying towards our VOR, which is nice. Just trying to get an eye on who that is, in fact. Got a feeling it is one of my viewers or subscribers. Maybe. Maybe not. Thankfully, with multiplayer, you can't crash into each other because that would be an absolute nightmare. I would literally have to turn multiplayer off to record these videos. I like to keep it on. So there we go. As we're coming very close to it now. Daventry is just here. As we get towards this line's going to become more sensitive. It's going to go left or right. I'm going to stop chasing it eventually. I'll just bank right and just keep chasing it for the moment. Altitude's... yeah, altitude's fine now. It's settling down. Just banking right just to chase it, just to keep it centered. And like I said, once we fly towards the center, you'll see that tab change, that triangle come down here to say we're flying away from it. Now I need to bank right. We're getting very close to it. So like I say, I'll show you this as well, how twitchy it can become. Essentially what I would do is stop and advise is stop chasing the VOR. If you know you're heading towards it, I can just keep it in that direction. In fact, I'm going to stop chasing it now. Because before you know it, that tab is going to change to the from. So just let that continue. Lots of people around this part of the country. Nice to see. Must be I'm expecting that's a group flying there. Looks like it. How are we doing? Are we getting towards that Daventry? We are right next to it. Look, right next to it. So any second, I'll just keep it in that view. You can see that line becoming more and more sensitive. We're right on top of it. Any second, this is going to change to a from. So that arrow, or that triangle will come down here to say we're flying away from. We've reached the center. We're flying away from the VOR in a second. I don't want my altitude to come down too much more. Let me just trim up slightly there. There's a bit of wind about. There you go. So now the triangle's here. We're flying away from that VOR. Let me just pause the sim. That's going to confuse the person who's flying around me. And we'll come back. Let me just switch you back to the map view. So here we are. We're in Daventry. We flew towards the centre. We've reached the centre. We're flying away from, roughly in this direction, from Daventry. Now, I want to change my VOR heading. I want to choose a different VOR. Why not choose Brecon Beacons VOR? 11745. And as you can see, that's probably around 210 degrees, 220 degrees. So I'm going to try, firstly, well, let's just set up this VOR frequency in our aircraft first. 11745. Switch you back to the sim. Take it off active pause. And just come back to this screen. So I'm just going to change this standby to 117. Using my knobs here. 11745. Move that to my active VOR now. And as you can see, it's got, let's zoom in a bit, it's got BCN Brecon, so you know you're locked on. So we can now fly towards that. Before I do that, I want to show you how you can fly away from a VOR. We are flying away from it. Like I said, that's about 210. That Brecon Beacons VOR is roughly about 210 degrees or so from our current heading. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to move that CDI, our OBS knob, essentially, or it would be the OBS, in the Cessna 152. It does the same thing, our course knob, let's just call it our course knob, to about 210 degrees there. Now, I'm not going to line this line up. I'm actually going to head towards this heading and coax that line in. So I'm flying on that 210 radial away from, remember the triangles here, we're flying away from that Daventry VOR. I hope that makes sense. So what I'm effectively showing you here now is how you can fly away from a VOR and lock on to one of the radials. So our aircraft will essentially head towards the other way in a moment. Let's move my mouse, not to confuse things. And you can do this in the Cessna 152 as well. In that case, it would be the OBS knob. Go and watch that video that I linked before about the Cessna 152 VOR. Cessna 152 VOR. Effectively, it's doing the same thing. You can do the same thing in that as we're doing here. So what I'm doing, I'm turning towards this heading, 210 degrees. I'm coming maybe 40 degrees past it to coax this line back to the center. And then I'll bank back to the left when this line is in the center to fly on that 210 degrees radial. It'll make sense as I fly towards it. So I'm just coming past the heading, like I've mentioned. About 40-50 degrees past it or so. Around about there will do. And I'm just going to wait for a moment for that line to come back towards the center. Actually come right a little bit more there. Not keeping a perfect trim there, it doesn't really matter. I've got the altitude I want. I'm just going to bank a little bit more right, just to encourage that line to move, start moving towards the centre. Once it starts moving towards the centre, I'm going to try and match my bearing, my actual bearing, to this course bearing, the reference bearing of the VOR, to fly on that radial. Let me just show you while that's... Let's hope that line doesn't move in. To fly on the radial of the Daventry VOR, which is here, flying it around one of the radials going in this direction, essentially. Is that line starting to move in? Not quite. Let's just bank to the right a little bit more. That should be enough to coax that line to come in. So I'm looking for this green line here to come towards the centre, and then I'll try and keep these lines all joined up and match my bearing to this bearing. Any second this should start to move in. It's a very hot day here today in the southeast, I've got to say, very warm. Just came back from a trip in London for a few days yesterday, so I was travelling back yesterday. It's tired me out a little bit. It was a very fast and furious few days I had there. But I do need to get out in this glorious weather while it's here. There we go, that line's moving towards the centre. So I'm going to try and match my bearing now. Banking left to get this arrow pointing upwards and match my actual bearing, my course, to the reference course of the VOR once that line is centred. Which is happening there. And let's come down to this screen. What's essentially happening there now, we're flying away from that VOR on that radial, and we're lined up on that radial flying away from. So the use of this is, if another VOR isn't so close, or the VOR you want to fly to, like Land's End is a little bit further away, so if I locked onto the Land's End VOR, it's too far away for me to lock onto. I can fly away from this for 100 miles or so until the Land's End VOR comes into range, then I can lock onto that. That's the use of flying away from, or one of the uses of flying away from a VOR. So keep it in mind, the triangle is here, we're flying away from the Daventry VOR, which I showed you before, flying away from it and heading somewhat towards this Brecon VOR. I actually spent some time in the Brecon Beacons. It's a lovely part of Wales. Absolutely glorious. Somewhere I need to visit again. So there we go. Pretty much set up on that course. We're flying away from that VOR. I did promise you some autopilot goodness. To make my life easier, I'm going to put my altitude at 1600 feet. Press my autopilot. And now it's autopilot's engaged. It will keep us around that 1600 feet altitude. I'm going to use my heading bearing, that blue bug you can see moving. Now I'll link the video showing how to set this up on the Velocity 1, and I've got other videos with other controllers that you can set this up. So you can just use your controller to move your heading bug. Now I've got that bug lined up with that course, I'm just going to go into heading mode. And to make my life easier, basically. So I can use my heading bug to bank me to the left to get that line back towards centre here. Don't need to worry about my altitude. I just need to actually vertical speed and nose up a little bit just to get to that 1600 feet and keep us there. It will keep us at that altitude. Just using my heading bug to line up this line back in the centre. It's cheating a little bit, but you know, why not? You're in a modern aircraft with modern autopilot, so you can use your autopilot, heading mode in this case, just to make your life a little bit easier. Let me move that heading bug a little bit more to the left. Coax that line in. come down. I don't need to worry about altitude any longer, or trimming, because it's under autopilot control. Come on, get back to the centre. Okay. So it's coming back towards the centre slowly. Once it's fully lined up, we'll switch our VOR back to that Brecon and actually line up. Dial in the frequency, use our CDI, our course knob, to line up on a radial to fly towards Brecon. We should be flying somewhat towards it anyway, because we're flying in that general direction. There you go, that line's back in sync now. And we're flying on that radial away from the Daventry VOR. Let's swap nav. Hope this is not confusing, but I'm swapping my active nav to the Brecon beacon. Now I'm going to use my CDI button. Let's range in a bit there. To change the... the aircraft's not changing course. It's staying on 206 degrees. I'm changing the reference course to get that line back into the centre. And what this will tell us is what course to follow. There we go, it's coming to the centre now. So we need to turn towards a sort of westerly heading, which I can use my autopilot to do that, my heading mode. Fly towards this way. I'm just going to fly past it to coax that line, keep that line centred. And we should be flying perfectly towards, or near enough perfectly towards, the centre of the Brecon VOR in this case. Keep in mind, if you try this in a different location, keep an eye on these triangles. If that's pointing up, you're flying towards it. Just think of it this way. If triangle's pointing towards your big arrow, you're flying towards it. If it's pointing down here, you're flying away from that VOR. So at the moment, we're flying pretty much perfectly towards that Brecon beacon. This line's not going to become twitchy or over responsive because we're a long way from that Brecon beacon. What I'll do, I'll just try and line that up perfectly, and then we'll go and land. And you can do this, fly towards the Brecon beacon. Once you flew towards the centre, practice flying away from it, and then go and fly somewhere else or wherever you want to in the world. You know what, that will do. And there's an airport right ahead of me. I'm going to do something crazy here. I'm going to do something absolutely crazy. I can't resist that runway right ahead of me there. I'm just wondering if I'm going to make it. I hope so, because it will be a disastrous end to the video otherwise. Oh, look at that. Why not? Why not? We should be okay. Should be fine. Somewhat off the runway. Oh. Maybe. Yeah, not my finest landing, but... You know what? I get myself down. Come on, coax it down. Just maybe going to make this before the end of the runway. And that will do. Let's just see, shall we? Oh. That was a close one. Just couldn't resist that when I see a runway like that. I like to try my luck. And I made it. Somewhat. Aircraft's going to probably fall to pieces once I step outside of it. Well, listen, that's VOR to VOR flying in something like the Cessna 172 Grand Caravan, G1000 displays, Glass Cockpit Displays. That's how you do it. Do let me know your thoughts on the video. If it's been helpful, give it a thumbs up. Let me know your thoughts below. Subscribe for more. And I'll see you soon.